Imagine a spring, a single season, so full of hope and new ideas that it genuinely terrified an empire. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1968, when Czechoslovakia dared to dream of something they called socialism with a human face. But that dream, it got crushed by the treads of Soviet tanks. This is the incredible story of the Prague Spring. So that's the big question, right? How does a movement for reform, a movement led by actual communists, end with a massive military invasion? What was so dangerous about this dream of a gentler kind of socialism? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. And to really get it, we're going to break the whole story down. We'll start with the seeds of discontent that were planted years before. Then we'll look at the dream itself, this human face for socialism. We'll see Moscow's growing panic, the invasion, the grim normalization that came after, and finally, the incredible legacy that just refused to die. All right, first up, the seeds of discontent. Because before you get a bloom like the Prague Spring, you have to have a long, cold winter. And by the 1960s, Czechoslovakia was pretty much frozen in place. The economy was sputtering, and political life was just completely suffocated. You know, while other countries in the Eastern Bloc were at least starting to grapple with the horrors of the Stalin era, Czechoslovakia's leader, a guy named Antonin Novotny, was really dragging his feet. So you've got this combination of a failing economy and a refusal to face the past, and people were just fed up. And you can literally see the pressure building on this timeline. What's so interesting is that it didn't start with politicians. It started with intellectuals. In 1963, just talking about a writer like Franz Kafka was a huge deal. Then, calls for economic reform started sparking calls for political reform. And by 1967, you have writers openly demanding freedom from the party. The whole thing was a pressure cooker. And into this pressure cooker steps a man named Alexander Dubček. When he takes over the Communist Party in early 1968, he's an insider, through and through. But he had this revolutionary idea. What if the party could actually lead people toward freedom instead of away from it? And this was his vision, socialism with a human face. Now this is super important. This was not about bringing in Western-style capitalism. The idea was actually to prove that socialism could offer more personal freedom, more genuine debate, and a better life than the democracies it was supposed to be competing with.
And wow, this wasn't just some vague slogan. The action program made it real. All of a sudden, censorship was gone. People could travel. The secret police had their power cut back. And for the first time in forever, people were even talking about the possibility of other political parties. This was a massive change.
This quote just nails the impact, doesn't it? Getting rid of censorship was like opening a floodgate. The media exploded with real debates, with investigations into past crimes, and with the voices of regular people. Politics was no longer something that happened behind closed doors. It was a national conversation.
But while people in Prague were celebrating this explosion of freedom, the folks in Moscow were watching in horror. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and the other Warsaw Pact bosses, well, they were not amused. And this chart shows you the core of the problem. What Dubček saw as necessary reforms, Brezhnev saw as a counter-revolution. To him, freedom of speech wasn't a good thing, it was a threat. Economic reform wasn't about efficiency, it was a slippery slope to capitalism. But the biggest fear? Contagion. If this worked in Czechoslovakia, what if Poland got ideas, or Hungary? The whole Soviet empire felt like it was on the line. So after a series of really tense meetings, the Soviets basically laid down the law. It became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, and its message was as simple as it was brutal. We have the right to invade any of our allies if we think they're threatening socialism. It was the ideological justification for what was about to happen. And on the night of August 20th, 1968, that doctrine became a horrifying reality. The talking was over. The tanks rolled in. Just look at the sheer scale of this thing. This wasn't just the Soviets, it was a multinational force. The idea was to pour in so much military might so quickly that the Czechoslovakian army wouldn't even have a chance to react. It was meant to be pure shock and awe.
But here's where the story gets incredible. Faced with this impossible situation, the Czech and Slovak people fought back. Not with guns, but with their courage and their wits. Dubček had asked them not to use violence, so they didn't. Instead, they argued with confused young soldiers, they stood in the path of tanks, and, my favorite part, they took down street signs or turned them around to point back toward Moscow. It was brilliant.
But as brave as it was, you can't stop an army with misdirection forever. The resistance fizzled out.
Dubček was arrested, flown to Moscow, and forced to back down. The Prague Spring was over, and in its place came a new, grim period with a chillingly Orwellian name: normalization.
Normalization was basically a slow, methodical effort to strangle every last bit of freedom won during the spring. A hardliner was put in charge. Hundreds of thousands were kicked out of the Communist Party. The country's best and brightest, writers, artists, professors, were fired and forced to work as janitors or boilermakers. The goal was to crush the spirit of 1968 and make everyone forget it ever happened.
And on the surface, for about 20 years, it looked like it worked. But underneath that forced silence, the memory of 1968 was kept alive. It lived on in underground music, in secret books, and in the minds of a generation that had, for a brief moment, tasted what freedom felt like.
And that's the ultimate point. This table draws a direct line from the failure of 1968 to the success of 1989. You see, the Prague Spring taught a hard lesson. You couldn't reform the system from the inside. It wouldn't let you. So when the next chance came, the goal wasn't to fix communism, it was to end it. And the Velvet Revolution did just that, peacefully fulfilling the dream that tanks had tried to crush.
And here's the ultimate historical irony. Even the Soviets eventually had to admit that the ideas of the Prague Spring weren't so crazy after all. By 1987, their own leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was pushing for similar reforms. And when a reporter asked what the difference was between his ideas and Dubček's, the official answer was just 19 years. It was basically an admission that Dubček hadn't been wrong, he'd just been ahead of his time.
Which brings us right back to that central question. The story of the Prague Spring seems to prove that while tanks can occupy a country and they can crush a government, they are completely powerless against an idea whose time has come. A dream of freedom, once it's planted, is pretty much impossible to kill.
The Prague Spring is such a pivotal moment in the Cold War. If you want to see how the fight for freedom continued, you should definitely check out our explainer on Poland's Solidarity movement next. And hey, for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching.